Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm so glad you stopped by today because today we are finally going to make our pumpkin dragon. I had a lot of you guys suggest this, and at first I wasn't sure how to go about making a pumpkin dragon, but then I decided to make it more of a camouflage type creature. Anyways, let's get started. Okay guys, so the first thing that I'm going to work on is the stem of our pumpkin dragon. This will be very similar to if you want to make horns for a dragon. You'll have to make those first, bake them, and then you can add them when you're sculpting the face. So that's what we're going to do here. So for our stem, I want to have a bit of a twist in it. So I'm going to roll out a strip of clay, kind of making it thinner on one side than the other, and then I'm just going to kind of twist it where I want it, and then run a wire through it to give it a little bit more support. Once I have that on the wire, I'm then going to start cleaning up the edges and making sure that when I stuck it on the wire that nothing got messed up. Then I'm going to move on to adding texture to it. So I'm going to need to add a bunch of rigid lines and crevices and cracks and just a bunch of different things going along the stem. So I'm going to start at the top and just kind of work my way down. Some of these lines are going to be thicker and deeper than others, and others are going to be very soft and subtle. We're just going to kind of make it look very organic and rough. Also make sure that your lines are following the shape of the stem and they're going along that spiral. After that, I decided that I want to add a little bit of a vine to this, so I'm going to roll out a strip of clay and then I'm going to kind of run it along the side of our stem. For this, I'm just going to kind of do it a little bit randomly. I am going to add a little twist here and there and just kind of make it look all wiggly and stuff. Once I had that in place, I'm then going to add a few leaves to it. So I'm just going to take some balls of clay, kind of roll them out into ovals, and then press them onto the surface where I want them. Then I'm just going to use my tools to blend them into that ivy. I'm going to make sure everything is positioned the way that I like it, and then I'm going to put this in the oven for probably about 45 minutes at 275 Fahrenheit. And then once that's out of the oven and it's cooled to touch, we can then move on to making the dragon's head. So for the dragon's head, you're going to want a lump of tinfoil as the base. We're going to connect this to a glass container. I'm just using a little bit of hot glue to hold it into place. That way it doesn't kind of shift around or fall off and we have something to hold on to. And then I'm going to take some strips of clay and I'm going to start wrapping it around our tinfoil. I'm going to go all the way up and then I'm going to blend everything together. That way we have a nice thick surface to work with. And then once we have everything blended together, we can start messing around with the basic shape of the head. For my dragon, I want the head to be kind of elongated and pointed, and my basic idea for the dragon's head is I want the very top of the head to be kind of like that part of the pumpkin you pop off like the lid, so it's going to have the stem and a little bit of the outer part of the pumpkin, but the rest of the head is going to be carved from the inside of the pumpkin. After that, I'm going to add the stem to the very top of the head, so I'm just going to take it, figure out where I want it, and stick it right in. And then after I have that in place, I'm going to clean up the edges to make sure it's a little bit more blended, and then I'm going to take a strip of clay and I'm going to go around this, about an inch away from the stem. Basically, I'm trying to make the very top of the pumpkin that you would have cut out to make the hole in the pumpkin. So this part that's going around the stem, this is going to have the texture of the outside of the pumpkin, so you'll want to add those creases and different things like that. And then I also added a little bit more detail around the base of the stem. I realized it needed to kind of stick up a little bit and be a little bit more rounded. And then for the edging of the pumpkin, as you get to where we're going to start carving it, I'm going to make that a little bit more jagged and sunken in, kind of separating it a little bit more. And then the rest of the features of the face I thought would be really cool if I made it look more jack-o'-lantern. So the eyes, they're basically going to be sunken in. So I'm going to make little triangles for those, just kind of make a top and bottom, and I'm pretty much framing nothing because I didn't add an eyeball. So I'm going to kind of frame that empty space that I want for the eye, and then I'm going to blend that clay into the rest of the face. And then I'm going to have to make the lines for the mouth and nose. So I'm going to kind of lightly sketch over the surface and figure out where I want those lines. And then once I like where those are placed, I'm going to go in and really refine them and make them a bit more deeper. And then once you have all your major details on the face, the eyes, the nose, the top of the pumpkin, just stuff like that, we're then going to start adding texture to the face. So the texture that we're going for is kind of a more chopped or carved texture of the inside of a pumpkin. So I'm just going to kind of lightly add little indents and stuff like that and make it look kind of bumpy, but we're also wanting a smooth texture as well. I'm basically trying to make it look like we actually used carving tools to make the face. And then once I'm happy with the face, I'm going to put this in the oven at 275 Fahrenheit for about 45 minutes. And while that's baking, we can start on the clay feet. So our dragon is going to be more of a wyvern than a dragon, so we're only going to have the back feet. So like most of my clay feet, these are going to need a wire frame. These are going to be pretty simple because I'm only going to go with 3 toes each foot, so we don't have to have a ton of wires everywhere. So I'm going to start adding clay to the wire frame. So first things first, we need to cover up that portion where all the wires are combined to kind of reinforce it and make sure nothing moves around when we start adding more detail. Then I'm going to add the claws to the very tips of all the wires. So I'm just going to roll out some little cones of clay, I'm going to stick it to the very end of that wire, and then kind of pinch it into the shape that I want. I am going to add a little bit of extra detail to the claws. I want to make them look a little bit more like wood, kind of like how we had the stem, so I'm going to add some lines going across the surface of them. So I'm just going to kind of do the same thing that we did with the stem. Once I get to this point, I do want to save my progress, so I'm going to stick this in the oven for about 20-25 minutes at the normal 275 Fahrenheit that we've been baking at. And then once our feet are done pre-baking, we can start adding more to the wire frame. So I'm going to start with the bottoms of the feet, and I'm going to take some strips of clay and I'm going to cover up that wire frame. So I'm going to go over the toes and kind of blend everything together until we have just a basic shape. Everything's just covered at this point. Now normally at this point when I'm making feet, I'm adding little wrinkles and creases around the toes to make it look like they can bend, but this one is a little bit different because it's made out of pumpkin, or at least we're trying to make it look like that. So I'm just going to add a little bit of a carved texture to the bottom of the foot, covering the whole surface, just like we did with the face, just a little bit more subtle. Moving on to the tops of the feet, I'm going to be doing these very similar to how I normally do my tops of my feet. For my dragons, I tend to just take balls of clay and layer them to make scales, but I want to mess around with the edges to make it look like it's cut pumpkin. So we already have the creases by doing the layered scales, but I really want to define it and make it look like the foot was carved out of the pumpkin. So I'm going to go in and kind of do the same thing that we did around the very top of the head and make a kind of a seam and a little bit of a jagged seam, that way it looks like you actually cut the pumpkin. And then after that, just so that everything kind of ties together a little bit more, I'm going to add some ivy to the sides of the feet as well. So I'm just going to take my strips of clay, and these are just going to be random. Both of the feet are going to be completely different. For once, I'm not going to make something symmetrical at all. I'm just going to kind of make it look a little bit symmetrical. But I ended up twisting the ivy on each foot a little bit differently and then just adding the leaves like we did with the stem. And then once I'm happy with how the feet look, I'm going to put them in the oven for one final bake, so it's going to be about 45 minutes at 275 Fahrenheit. And then once those are done baking and they've cooled to touch, we can move on to painting everything. Okay, so for the painting, this will be actually a little bit different for me because I normally don't work with yellows and oranges. I tend to stick more with the purples and blues and maybe a little bit more on the greens. Not sure why, I think I just like those colors more, but let's see what we can do. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to start with our clay face, and I'm going to be primering it. I almost want to say this is orange, but it's still closer to yellow. It's a very dark yellow. So I'm going to go over the entire clay face with this, and then we can start lightening it up. That way we have some shadows to work with. So I'm going to primer that, and then I'm going to take some brighter oranges and start going over the face portion that is going to be the inside of the pumpkin. So the inside of the pumpkin will be a lot more yellow, and then the outside portion is going to be a lot oranger. So I'm just going to mess around with this, and I'm going to just keep slowly adding brighter yellows until I like how the face looks. And then for the stem, we're going to be primering this with a brown. I'll have to probably go over it a few different times because the brown I have is a little bit sheer. So I'm going to start with a darker brown, and then like we did with the face, I'm going to start adding highlights to the top of it. So I'm just going to go over it and brighten up the more raised up portion of the stem. And then the little bit of outer pumpkin that we have going around the stem, I'm going to start painting that a nice orange. I'm then going to add a bit of a highlight to this to kind of brighten up the edges, and then I also want to add kind of a shadowing around where it meets the stem. I want it to be just a little bit darker there. Now you can definitely tell that I'm not 100% sure what I want to do with the painting for this because I kind of jump all over the place. So after I finished the orange of the pumpkin, I moved back to the actual face and I started painting all the details black. So I want to make it look like they're sunken in and kind of more dark. So I painted in the holes of the eyes, the mouth, and the nose. After that, I moved on to painting the ivy that wraps around our stem, so I'm going to go with a green for that. And then after that, I'm just going to add a little bit more of a highlight to the face, so I'm going to take some white paint and just kind of lightly go over different areas to brighten it up. Moving on to the feet, we're basically going to paint these the same way that we did the face, we just don't have to deal with all the facial details. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to be primering our clay feet with that same darker yellow. Once that's dried, we can then start brightening it up like we did with the face, and then I'm going to start painting the claws. Now normally with my claws, I don't know exactly why I do this, but I tend to just paint them black, but since we're trying to make our claws look like wood, we're going to be painting them in the same style that we did the stem. So they're going to be a darker brown, and then we'll add a brighter brown over the surface of that. And then once we have our claws done, I'm going to move on to the scales on the tops of the feet, and we're going to be painting these orange to make them look like the outside of the pumpkin. We can add some highlights to this, we can then start adding some darker colors in the creases of the pumpkin, and then lastly we're going to add that green to our ivy. And just because I felt like it, I'm going to add a little bit of a white highlight to the claws and the tips of the toes. So I'm going to let everything dry. Once it's dried, I'm going to cover everything in resin to help protect the paint and just make everything a little bit more sturdier. So that's going to have to sit and cure, so now what we're going to do is we're going to start on the sewing. So these are all the pattern pieces that I sketched out to make the body. I tried to leave the body as simple as possible, but I am going to go into a lot of detail with the wings because this is going to be kind of the way our pumpkin dragon is going to transform into a pumpkin. So we're going to start sewing on the body pieces and the legs first. So I'm going to take the neck portion and we're going to sew this to the body portion for the left and right side. Then I'm going to take our left and right sides of our body and we're going to sew down the very front of it, connecting them together. You'll want to leave the back open. Moving on to the legs, each leg has an inside portion and an outside portion. We're going to sandwich these together and sew down just the fronts of them. And just like the body, we're going to leave the back of these open. And now for the fun part, the wings. So these are going to be basically pieces of pumpkin. So I have the outside portion and the inside portion. The outside is going to be a flat plush orange and the inside is going to be a furry yellow. So I'm going to take the inside portions and the outside portions, we're going to sandwich them together and we're going to sew around the more bottom portion. And then once we have all those done, we can then sew these pieces together into one solid piece each. And then these wings are going to need an interesting wireframe because I want each part of the wing to be posable. So it kind of looks like how you would make a flower out of wire where you'd make the little petals. So each wing has 3 of those. And we're just going to slide these onto the wireframe and stuff and close them up. After we have those put together, we're then going to start messing around with the fur portion of the wing. So I'm going to start trimming around the base of them. I want everything to still be fluffy, kind of like the stringiness of the inside of the pumpkin, but I want the edges to be more clean. So I'm going to use my scissors and I'm also going to use my hair trimmer and just kind of clean everything up a little bit more. So I figured since we're already working on the wings and I really don't plan on using my fabric markers on anything else, I'm going to start using those to add some details to it. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take an orange and go around the seams and just kind of have it where it blends a little bit more, just kind of has a little bit more of a fade from the orange to the yellow. And then I'm going to go into all the cracks of the pumpkin and I'm going to slowly darken these. I'm going to start with a brown, but eventually I'll probably need a bit more of a black color in the end, but I didn't want to start too dark. And then the only other thing that I'm going to be using my fabric markers on is going to be the tail. So the tail is going to be kind of like an ivy, so I have a bit of the yellow fur fabric as a long strip, and I'm just going to start adding some greens to this. Okay, so at this point I have all the different body pieces ready and our clay pieces have finished curing. So we're going to start putting our doll together. So I'm going to take our clay head and I'm going to stick a wire into the back of it and glue that into place. This is going to be the spine, so you'll want this to be the full length of the dragon, all the way to the end of the tail. And then I'm going to take the fabric for the tail and run it onto the wire. Basically what I did to sew this was I kind of sewed it closed on one end to make it kind of look like a sock, and we're just sliding it over the wire. And then I'm taking the body of the dragon and I'm going to take the neck portion and start gluing it around the base of the head. You'll want to let that dry a little bit, and then I'm going to start adding the wires for the legs. So I just made some extra wires that we need to connect, and then I'm also going to connect the wires for the wings. And those are already in the wings, so they're going to be in the way a little bit, but you'll just have to kind of work around them while you're wrapping everything together. Then I can take the body of the dragon, figure out where the wings are going to rest, and start sewing the wings into place on the side of that. And then after that, we're going to stuff and close up our dragon. So that strip of fabric that we used for the tail, that's going to also extend all the way to the back of the head. So we're going to sew this down the back of the dragon, closing everything up. And then after you get that sewn into place, we're going to glue that to the back of the head. Moving on to adding the legs, we're going to take the fabric for the legs, we're going to figure out where we want them on the body, and we're going to sew them in place around the wires that we have sticking out for those legs. Then we can take those wires and we can cut and bend them into the correct shape and length that we need and add the clay legs to the end of it. So I'm just going to wrap these in place, and then we can take the fabric for the legs and glue them around the bases of our clay feet. You'll want to let that dry a little bit, and then you can stuff and close up the back of the legs. Okay, so our dragon is all put together right now, but I wanted to add a little bit more detail to the inside of it. So the inside portion of the wings, I want to make it look a little bit more stringier, and then I also wanted to add pumpkin seeds. So I need to make my pumpkin seeds. So what I decided to make the seeds out of is Instamorph. It's already pre-dyed, and I already have it cut into little individual pieces, so they'll all be roughly about the same size. So basically what I'm doing is I'm melting them, making them into a little bit of an oval, and then flattening them and pinching one side to kind of make that one little pointed edge. So for the more stringy portion, what I'm going to be using is yellow yarn. So I've cut this into a bunch of little small pieces, and I'm just going to kind of clump it together and sew it into place in just different spots on the inside portion of the wings. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to take my pumpkin seeds and I'm going to glue them in place on the inside of the pumpkin wings. For this, I'm just randomly deciding where I want them, but I did make sure that each wing had this same amount of pumpkin seeds because I'm weird like that. And then lastly, we need to add some detail to the tail. So I want to make it look a little bit more like a vine. So I have this one dark green yarn that's really thick and fluffy, and then I also have this kind of twine that has these leaves connected to it, and I'm just going to take both of those, twist them together, and then wrap them around the tail, starting at the base of the head and just kind of working my way down until I get to the end of the tail. Okay guys, and this is our little pumpkin dragon. I had so much fun with this. I think it was my first attempt at doing like a creature that transforms in a weird way. I mean, it's a very simple transformation. He just kind of tucks into himself, but I had a lot of fun with it. I loved making his wings and all the little pumpkin seeds and stuff inside of him, and it's definitely an interesting challenge. I'm so glad you guys suggested doing this. Anyways, I'm going to have my pumpkin dragon in my Etsy shop, so if anyone is interested in buying him, check the links down below. I also have affiliated links to all the art supplies that I tend to really like using to make my art dolls. These, again, are affiliated links, so they do kind of help support the channel if you buy anything through them. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, do all that fun stuff, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!